The air tasted like rain and lavender when I first met Marco Benedetti, standing under the awning of a small Italian cafe in Brooklyn on a humid June evening. Water pooled at the curb, reflecting the neon signs of the surrounding shops, and the smell of espresso mixed with wet concrete filled my lungs. He was arguing with the barista about the proper way to pull an espresso shot, his hands moving in that distinctly Italian way, fingers pressed together, waving through the air like he was conducting an invisible orchestra. His voice carried over the sound of traffic, passionate and warm, with just enough of an accent to make every word feel like it mattered. I had ducked under that awning to escape the sudden downpour, clutching my portfolio against my chest, my hair plastered to my forehead and my white blouse clinging uncomfortably to my skin. He turned, mid-gesture, and our eyes met. His were the color of strong coffee, almost black in the dim light, and they softened immediately. The argument forgotten, he smiled, and I felt something shift in my chest, like a door opening that I hadn't known was locked. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of Sunday dinners and stolen kisses in doorways. 3 years of learning to roll gnocchi and listening to him sing old Italian songs while he cooked. 3 years of falling deeper and deeper in love with a man who tasted like home, even though I had never been to Italy. 3 years that led us here, to this moment, where everything should have been perfect, but instead felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. The problem was not Marco. The problem was never Marco. The problem wore black from head to toe, stood barely 5 feet tall, and had eyes like a hawk surveying prey. The problem was Lucia Benedetti, Marco's mother, and she had decided from the very first moment she met me that I was not good enough for her son. I remember that first meeting with painful clarity. Marco had been nervous, unusually quiet as we climbed the stairs to his childhood apartment in Bensonhurst. The building smelled of tomato sauce and old wood, layered scents that spoke of decades of Italian families cooking, arguing, loving, and living within these walls. The hallway carpet was worn thin in the center, showing the path countless feet had traveled over the years. Marco squeezed my hand 3 times as we stood outside the door, our secret signal, the one that meant I love you without having to say the words out loud. When Lucia opened the door, I felt the wave of heat from the apartment wash over us, carrying with it the scent of garlic, basil, and something sweet baking in the oven. She was smaller than I expected, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face lined but still beautiful in that severe, classical way. She looked at me, and her expression did not change. No smile. No warmth. Just those dark eyes taking in every detail of my appearance, from my carefully chosen dress to my nervous smile, cataloging and finding me wanting. She spoke in rapid Italian to Marco, her voice sharp and clipped. He responded in the same language, his tone pleading. I stood there, my smile freezing on my face, my hands clasped in front of me like a child waiting for permission to enter. The smell of Sunday gravy, as Marco called his mother's tomato sauce, made my stomach growl despite my nervousness. Finally, she stepped aside, a jerky movement that felt more like a challenge than an invitation. The apartment was small but immaculate, every surface polished, every picture frame perfectly aligned. Religious icons hung on the walls alongside family photographs spanning generations. The dining table was already set, white linen and good china, wine glasses catching the light from the chandelier overhead. Everything spoke of tradition, of old-world values, of a life built on rules I did not know and could not follow. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Lucia served course after course, each one more delicious than the last, but she directed all her attention to Marco, speaking only in Italian, acting as if I were invisible. When Marco tried to translate or include me in the conversation, she would wave her hand dismissively and change the subject. I ate in silence, tasting nothing, my throat tight with the effort of not crying. Marco's father, Giuseppe, was a quiet man with kind eyes and hands stained from years of working in his auto repair shop. He tried, in his limited English, to ask me about my work, about my family, but Lucia would interrupt, redirecting the conversation before I could answer more than a few words. By the time dessert was served, a perfect tiramisu that tasted like coffee and cream and heartbreak, I knew that this woman would never accept me. As we left that night, standing on the stoop in the cooling September air, Marco pulled me close, his arms tight around me, his face buried in my hair. I could feel his heart beating against my chest, fast and hard, and when he pulled back, his eyes were wet. I am so sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. She will come around. She just needs time. But she never did come around. Over the following months, I tried everything. I learned Italian phrases, I studied Italian cooking, I wore the right clothes and said the right things, but nothing was ever enough. Lucia looked at me with those cold eyes and saw only an American girl, not Italian enough, not Catholic enough, not worthy of her precious son. The worst part was not the coldness or the criticism. The worst part was watching Marco try to bridge the gap between us, watching him slowly tear himself apart trying to make us both happy. He would come to my apartment after Sunday dinners at his parents' house, and I could see the exhaustion in his face, the weight of his mother's disapproval pressing down on his shoulders. He would hold me and apologize, over and over, as if her actions were his fault. But I loved him. God help me, I loved him so completely that I would have endured anything to be with him. And so when he proposed, on a cold December night on the Brooklyn Bridge, the city lights reflecting off the water below us, the wind cutting through our coats, I said yes without hesitation. He slipped the ring on my finger with shaking hands, his grandmother's ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond, and kissed me like I was the answer to every prayer he had ever spoken. We told his family the next day. Marco insisted we go together, that we face them as a united front. I dressed carefully, choosing a conservative dress, pulling my hair back, trying to look as respectable as possible. My hands were shaking as we climbed those familiar stairs, and the smell of the building, usually comforting in its consistency, made my stomach churn with anxiety. Lucia answered the door, and her eyes went immediately to my left hand. I saw her face change, saw something dark and furious flash across her features before she schooled them back into that neutral mask. She stepped aside without a word, and we entered that small, perfect apartment once more. Giuseppe was in his chair, reading the newspaper, but he looked up when we entered, his expression hopeful. Marco cleared his throat, squeezed my hand, and announced our engagement in Italian. I understood enough now to catch the important words, fidanzata, sposare, amore. The silence that followed felt like a physical thing, pressing down on us from all sides. Giuseppe stood, slowly, his newspaper falling to the floor, forgotten. He crossed the room and embraced Marco, then turned to me, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled and kissed both my cheeks, his stubble rough against my skin. He congratulated us in broken English, his voice warm and genuine. But Lucia did not move. She stood by the door, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale and rigid. When Marco approached her, speaking softly, trying to include her in our joy, she shook her head once, a sharp, definitive movement. "No," she said, the word cutting through the apartment like a knife. "No. You will not marry this girl." Marco's face went white. "Mama," he started, but she held up her hand, silencing him. "She is not for you," Lucia continued, her English heavily accented but perfectly clear. "She is not one of us. She does not understand our family, our traditions, our faith. You will not marry her." The room spun. I gripped Marco's hand tighter, my nails digging into his palm. Giuseppe tried to intervene, speaking rapidly in Italian, his voice raised, but Lucia ignored him. She stared at Marco, and I saw the same determination in her eyes that I had seen every Sunday dinner, every holiday, every time she looked at me. Marco's voice, when he finally spoke, was steady but cold in a way I had never heard before. "I am 32 years old, Mama. I am not asking your permission. We are getting married, with or without your blessing." "Then you do it without me," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "If you marry this girl, you are no longer my son." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and terrible. Giuseppe made a choking sound, reaching for his wife, but she shook him off. Marco's hand trembled in mine, and I could feel his whole body shaking, though his face remained impassive. We left without another word. Down the stairs, out into the December cold, past the buildings that no longer felt welcoming. Marco did not speak until we were on the subway, the train rattling through the tunnel, the fluorescent lights harsh and flickering overhead. Then he pulled me close and whispered, "I choose you. No matter what, I choose you." But the cost of that choice became clear over the following months as we planned our wedding. Lucia refused to discuss it, refused to acknowledge our engagement at all. She would not return my calls, would not accept my invitations to meet for coffee or to go dress shopping. When Marco visited his parents, she would leave the room if he mentioned my name. Giuseppe tried to play peacemaker, visiting us in secret, bringing his wife's regards even though we all knew she had sent none, but even he could not bridge the chasm that had opened between Marco and his mother. We decided to have the wedding at St. Anthony's, a small Catholic church in Park Slope where Marco had been baptized and confirmed. Father Michael, who had known the Benedetti family for decades, agreed to perform the ceremony despite Lucia's objections. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with white hair and gentle blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. When we met with him for pre-marriage counseling, he listened patiently to our story, nodding occasionally, his weathered hands folded on the desk in front of him. "Love is never easy," he said when we finished, his voice carrying the faint lilt of an Irish accent that decades in Brooklyn had not erased. "And family, well, family is the hardest thing of all. But if you two are committed to each other, if you truly love one another, then you will find a way through this. Lucia is a stubborn woman, always has been, but she is not a cruel one. Give her time." But time was running out. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June, exactly 3 years after that rainy night when we met. The invitations had been sent, the venue booked, the flowers ordered. My dress hung in my closet, a simple ivory gown with lace sleeves that reminded me of old photographs of my grandmother's wedding. Everything was ready except for the most important thing, Marco's family. Giuseppe had promised to come, had even convinced Marco's younger sister, Daniela, to attend, though she did it against her mother's wishes and paid the price in cold shoulders and disapproving looks. But Lucia remained firm in her refusal. She would not come to the wedding. She would not bless our union. She would not acknowledge me as part of her family. The night before the wedding, I could not sleep. I lay in bed in my small studio apartment, listening to the sounds of the city outside my window, sirens and cars and voices raised in argument or laughter. The air was thick and warm, presaging the heat that would arrive with summer, and my thin nightgown stuck to my skin. I thought about Marco, staying with his best man in another part of the city, honoring the tradition that we should not see each other before the ceremony. I thought about the dress waiting in the closet, about the flowers being arranged even now in the church basement, about Father Michael practicing his homily. And I thought about Lucia, about her stern face and her cold eyes, about the way she had looked at me in that first meeting and every meeting since, like I was something dirty that had been tracked in on someone's shoe. I thought about the cost of this wedding, not in money but in family, in the relationship between mother and son that might never be repaired. I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if my love for Marco was worth the pain it was causing. But then I remembered his hands, strong and gentle, shaping pasta dough in his small kitchen. I remembered his laugh, free and unguarded, when we watched old movies together. I remembered the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world, like I was something precious and rare. And I knew, no matter the cost, I could not give him up. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect June day that felt like a blessing. I woke to sunlight streaming through my window, warming my face, and for a moment, before memory returned, I felt nothing but joy. Then reality crashed back, and my stomach clenched with anxiety. My maid of honor, Sarah, arrived at 9 in the morning, her arms full of coffee and bagels and nervous energy. She had been my best friend since college, had seen me through bad relationships and worse haircuts, and now she herded me through the morning routine with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. Shower. Hair. Makeup. The apartment filled with the smell of hairspray and perfume, overlaying the ever-present scent of the city in summer. Other bridesmaids arrived, friends from work and college, their voices bright and excited, filling the small space with laughter and chatter. They helped me into my dress, careful with the delicate lace, and I stood in front of the full-length mirror, barely recognizing myself. The woman looking back at me was beautiful, radiant even, her hair swept up in an elegant twist, her makeup subtle but perfect. But her eyes were scared. Sarah caught my gaze in the mirror, her reflection standing behind mine, her hand on my shoulder. "He loves you," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the noise of the others. "That is all that matters. He loves you, and you love him. The rest will work itself out." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and touched the necklace at my throat, a simple gold cross that had been my grandmother's. She had worn it at her own wedding, had worn it every day of her married life, and my mother had pressed it into my hand the night before, her eyes wet with tears. "For luck," she had whispered. "For love." The church was cool when we arrived, a welcome relief from the heat building outside. It smelled of old wood and candles and flowers, a combination that was both sacred and familiar. The pews were already filling with guests, their voices a soft murmur that echoed off the high ceiling. I waited in the small room off the entrance, my hands shaking as I held my bouquet, white roses mixed with Italian jasmine, their scent sweet and heady. Through the door, I could hear the organist playing softly, traditional hymns that had been sung in this church for generations. Sarah peeked out, reporting back on who had arrived. My parents, sitting in the front row, my mother already dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Marco's college friends, filling several pews on his side. Giuseppe, sitting alone in the front row on the groom's side, looking smaller somehow, diminished by the empty space beside him where Lucia should have been. Daniela slipped into my waiting room just before the ceremony was set to begin, her face flushed and her eyes red. She hugged me quickly, fierce and brief, and whispered, "I am so sorry. She is not coming." I tried, but she would not listen. I squeezed her hand, unable to speak around the lump in my throat, and she slipped back out to take her place in the church. The wedding coordinator, a brisk woman with kind eyes and an efficient manner, checked her watch and nodded to Sarah. It was time. The music changed, shifting to the processional. Sarah and the other bridesmaids filed out, their steps measured and practiced. Then it was just me and my father, his arm solid under my hand, his face a mixture of pride and barely contained emotion. The coordinator gave us the signal, the doors opened, and suddenly I was walking down the aisle, every eye in the church on me. But I only saw Marco. He stood at the altar in a dark suit, his hair freshly cut, his face clean-shaven, and when our eyes met, he smiled. It was not a big smile, not the grin I had fallen in love with, but something quieter, more profound. It was a smile that said, I see you, I choose you, I will always choose you. And in that moment, everything else fell away. Father Michael stood behind the altar, his white vestments glowing in the light streaming through the stained glass windows. The altar was decorated with white flowers and tall candles, their flames dancing in the slight breeze from the open doors. I took my place beside Marco, and he took my hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on my palm, our secret signal translated into touch. Dearly beloved, Father Michael began, his voice strong and clear, carrying easily through the church. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Marco Giuseppe Benedetti and Emma Catherine Harper in holy matrimony. The words washed over me, familiar from 100 movies and TV shows but suddenly profound in their reality. This was happening. We were actually doing this. Marco and I were standing in front of God and family and friends, promising forever. His hand tightened on mine, and I glanced at him, saw the emotion swimming in his dark eyes, the way his jaw clenched as he fought for control. Father Michael continued through the opening prayers and readings, and then it was time for the vows. Marco turned to face me fully, taking both my hands in his, and I could see that he was shaking, could feel the tremor in his fingers. His voice, when he spoke, was rough with emotion, but every word was clear. Emma, I take you to be my wife. I promise to love you, to honor you, to cherish you, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as we both shall live. You are my heart, my home, my everything. Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I did not bother to wipe them away as I repeated the same words back to him, my voice breaking on the last line. Then it was time for the rings, and Marco's best man stepped forward, producing the simple gold bands we had chosen together. Father Michael held up the rings, blessing them with a prayer, and then turned to Marco. Marco Giuseppe Benedetti, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward? I do, Marco said, his voice strong and sure, and he slipped the ring onto my finger, his hand steady now, committed. Father Michael turned to me, asked the same question, and I answered with the same 2 words that felt like the easiest thing I had ever said. I do. The ring was cool and smooth as I slid it onto Marco's finger, and he looked at it for a moment, a soft smile playing at his lips. Then Father Michael raised his hands, preparing to pronounce us husband and wife, and the church doors crashed open. The sound echoed through the space like a gunshot, and every head turned. Lucia Benedetti stood in the doorway, her black dress stark against the bright sunlight behind her, her face pale and set. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps loud in the sudden silence, and stopped halfway to the altar. She was breathing hard, like she had been running, and her hands clutched a small purse in front of her like a shield. Father Michael, she said, her voice carrying through the church despite its roughness. Father Michael, please. I must speak. Before you finish this ceremony, I must speak. The church was silent except for the sound of her breathing and the distant traffic outside. Marco's hand tightened painfully on mine, and I felt him tense beside me, felt the anger radiating off him in waves. Father, he said, his voice low and dangerous, please continue the ceremony. But Father Michael held up his hand, his expression thoughtful. Lucia, he said gently, what is it you need to say? She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than coldness in her eyes. I saw pain. I saw fear. I saw something desperate and raw that made my heart clench despite everything. This girl, she started, then stopped, swallowed hard. This girl, she cannot marry my son. A murmur ran through the assembled guests, shock and disapproval mixing in equal measure. Giuseppe half rose from his seat, his face dark with anger, but Father Michael gestured for him to sit. Marco made a sound low in his throat, almost a growl, and moved as if to step toward his mother, but I held his hand tight, keeping him beside me. Lucia, Father Michael said, his voice still gentle but with an edge of steel beneath it, you have had many months to express your objections to this union. Why now? Why here? Because, she said, and her voice broke, because I know something. Something that Father Michael knows too. Something that must be spoken before it is too late. Father Michael's face, which had been composed and calm, suddenly went pale. He gripped the edge of the altar, his knuckles white, and I saw something flash across his features that looked like fear. Lucia, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, do not do this. Not here. Not now. I must, she said, and turned to face Marco and me fully. Her eyes were wet now, tears streaming down her lined face, and her whole body shook. I must tell the truth, even if it destroys everything. Even if it destroys me. The church felt too small, too hot, despite the coolness that had been so refreshing earlier. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, loud and fast, and Marco's hand in mine had gone sweaty. Father Michael looked between Lucia and us, his face a mask of conflict, and then he sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from his very soul. Perhaps, he said slowly, we should speak privately. In the sacristy. Not here, not in front of everyone. No, Lucia said, shaking her head violently. No more secrets. No more lies. It ends here, now, in front of God and everyone. Let them all know the truth. She took a step closer to the altar, and I saw Giuseppe stand, moving to join his wife, his hand reaching for her arm. But she shook him off, her eyes fixed on Father Michael with an intensity that was almost frightening. Tell them, she said to the priest. Tell them what you know. What you have always known. Tell them why this wedding cannot happen. Father Michael closed his eyes, and I saw his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. When he opened them again, they were filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. He looked at Marco, then at me, and finally back to Lucia. I made a vow, he said quietly. A sacred vow, given under the seal of confession. I cannot break it, Lucia. Even now, even for this, I cannot break it. Lucia laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the stone walls. Then I will break it for you, she said. I will tell them what you will not. She turned to face the assembled guests, her chin raised, her whole body vibrating with emotion. When my Marco was born, she said, her English heavily accented but clear, there were complications. I nearly died. The bleeding, it would not stop. They took me to surgery, and when I woke, the doctor told me I could never have more children. My womb, it was ruined. Giuseppe made a sound of protest, but Lucia continued, her words tumbling out faster now, like a dam breaking. But 2 years later, I found I was pregnant again. Impossible, the doctors said. A miracle, the priest said. And so we accepted it, we celebrated it, we thanked God for his mercy. She paused, wiping her face with shaking hands. But it was not a miracle, she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It was a lie. The baby, she was not mine. She was not ours. The church exploded in noise, gasps and whispers and shocked exclamations. I looked at Marco, saw the confusion on his face, the way his brow furrowed as he tried to make sense of his mother's words. Daniela, who had been sitting in the third row, stood up, her face white, her hand pressed to her mouth. Mama, Marco said, his voice rough, what are you saying? Daniela is your daughter. Our sister. No, Lucia said, turning to look at her son with eyes full of grief. No, Marco. She is not your sister. Not truly. She is your cousin. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the sounds from outside seemed to fade away, leaving only the terrible weight of Lucia's words hanging in the air. Giuseppe sank back into his pew, his face gray, and I saw him cross himself, his lips moving in silent prayer. My sister, Lucia continued, her voice shaking, she was young, stupid, she got pregnant by a boy who would not marry her. She came to me, begging for help, and I could not let her shame our family. So we made a plan. She would have the baby in secret, and Giuseppe and we would raise her as our own. We told everyone it was a miracle, that God had blessed us with another child. And Father Michael, he knew. We told him in confession, seeking forgiveness, and he kept our secret all these years. Father Michael stood behind the altar, his face carved from stone, his eyes distant. The seal of confession is sacred, he said quietly. What is told to a priest in that sacrament cannot be revealed, not for any reason, not even this. But you see, Lucia said, turning back to Marco and me, you see why I could not let you marry. When you brought Emma home, when I saw her for the first time, I knew who she was. The world tilted, and I felt Marco's hand slip from mine as I stumbled backward. Sarah caught me, her arms strong around my waist, holding me up as my knees threatened to give way. I stared at Lucia, my mind refusing to process her words, refusing to accept what she was saying. Her eyes, Lucia said, looking at me with a mixture of pity and pain. She has my sister's eyes. The same green, the same shape. And her smile, the way she laughs, it is like looking at Maria 30 years ago. I knew, but I told myself I was being foolish. The world is full of people who look alike. But then Giuseppe, he did some research. Your mother's maiden name, it is Russo. And my sister, she married a man named James Harper, an American soldier, right after she gave up the baby. They moved to California, had you several years later. My mother, I whispered, my voice not sounding like my own. My mother's name is Maria. Maria Harper. Yes, Lucia said, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. My baby sister. And you, Emma, you are her daughter. Which makes you Daniela's niece. Which makes you Marco's cousin. The church seemed to spin around me, and I heard someone scream, a high, keening sound that I realized distantly was coming from my own throat. Marco was saying my name over and over, but I could not focus on his voice, could not focus on anything except the terrible truth that Lucia had just revealed. We were cousins. Marco and I were cousins. This wedding, this love, everything we had built together was founded on a relationship that should never have happened. I heard Father Michael speaking, his voice cutting through the chaos that had erupted in the church, calling for calm, calling for understanding. I heard Giuseppe's voice, rough with emotion, confirming his wife's story, admitting the lie they had lived for nearly 30 years. I heard Daniela sobbing, her world shattered in an instant, her entire identity called into question. But mostly I heard Marco, his voice breaking as he said my name, reaching for me, trying to hold me even as I pulled away. Because how could I let him touch me now? How could I stand here in this church, in this white dress, with these promises still hanging in the air between us, knowing what we were to each other? Sarah guided me away from the altar, back toward the small room where I had waited before the ceremony, and I went numbly, my body moving on autopilot while my mind screamed. Behind us, I could hear people standing, voices raised in shock and question, the careful order of the ceremony dissolving into chaos. In the small room, Sarah sat me down on the worn velvet couch and knelt in front of me, her hands gripping mine. "Emma," she said, her voice urgent, "Emma, you need to breathe. Just breathe." But I could not breathe. My chest felt too tight, my lungs refusing to expand, and spots danced in front of my eyes. Distantly, I heard Sarah calling for water, for someone to help, and then there were more people in the room, voices overlapping, hands touching me, trying to help. Through it all, I heard Marco's voice outside the door, demanding to be let in, to see me, to explain. But what was there to explain? The truth was simple and horrible. We were related. Everything we had felt, everything we had shared, was wrong. Tainted. Forbidden. I do not know how long I sat there, frozen and shaking, while the world continued around me. Eventually, my father came, his face pale and drawn, and he gathered me into his arms like I was a child again. He smelled like Old Spice and the mint gum he always chewed, familiar and safe, and I buried my face in his shoulder and finally let myself cry. The church slowly emptied, guests leaving in small groups, their voices hushed and shocked. I heard the wedding coordinator directing people, heard her professional voice maintaining some semblance of order even in the face of this disaster. And through it all, Father Michael's voice, steady and calm, trying to bring peace to a situation that had no peace to offer. When I finally emerged from that small room, the church was nearly empty. The candles still burned on the altar, the flowers still perfumed the air, but the joy that should have filled this space was gone, replaced by a grief so profound it seemed to seep into the very walls. Marco stood alone at the altar, his suit rumpled, his face ravaged by tears. When he saw me, he took a step forward, his hand outstretched, but stopped when he saw me flinch. The pain that crossed his face in that moment was almost too much to bear. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse, "please. We need to talk about this. We need to figure this out." But I shook my head, unable to find words, unable to even look at him properly. Because if I let myself see the man I loved standing there in his wedding suit, I would break completely. And I needed to stay whole long enough to get out of this church, to get away, to process the impossible thing that had just happened. My father's arm tightened around my shoulders, and he guided me toward the door, past the rows of empty pews, past the altar where I should have become Marco's wife, past Father Michael, who watched with sorrowful eyes. At the door, I stopped, looked back once, and saw Lucia standing with Giuseppe, her small frame seeming even smaller somehow, her face buried in her husband's chest as she wept. Daniela sat alone in a pew, staring at nothing, and I felt a surge of sympathy for her. She had lost her identity today, had learned that everything she thought she knew about herself was a lie. I wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but what comfort could I give when I was drowning in my own grief? Outside, the June sunshine felt obscene, too bright and cheerful for the devastation we had just experienced. My mother waited on the church steps, her face streaked with tears, and she pulled me into her arms the moment she saw me. "I am so sorry," she whispered into my hair. "I am so sorry, baby." Sarah appeared with my purse and phone, practical even in crisis, and my father helped me into their car. As we pulled away from the church, I turned to look back one last time. Marco stood on the steps, his hand raised as if in farewell or supplication, his face a mask of anguish. And then we turned the corner, and he was gone. Continua a história. The days that followed passed in a blur of shock and numbness. I moved through them like a ghost, unable to fully process what had happened, unable to reconcile the joy I had felt that morning with the devastation that afternoon had brought. I stayed at my parents' house in Queens, unable to face my own apartment with its memories of Marco, its smell of his cooking, its echo of his laughter. My mother tried to explain, sitting on the edge of my childhood bed while I stared at the ceiling, but her words only made everything more confusing. She had been estranged from her sister Lucia for years, she said, a rift that began before I was born over some family matter she would not detail. When my grandmother died 10 years ago, they had briefly reconciled at the funeral, but the distance remained. She had not known about Daniela's true parentage, had not suspected the secret Lucia and Giuseppe had kept for so long. Your father and I, we thought about reaching out more, trying to rebuild that relationship, she said, her hand gentle on my hair. But Lucia never responded to our overtures, and eventually, we stopped trying. I never could have imagined. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to put into words the horrible coincidence that had brought Marco and me together, made us fall in love, brought us to the edge of marriage before tearing it all away. Marco called 17 times that first day. Then 32 times the second day. By the third day, the calls had stopped, replaced by text messages that I could not bring myself to read. Sarah came by each afternoon, sitting with me in silence, offering the kind of companionship that did not require words or explanations. My father took time off work, something he never did, and I would hear him downstairs, talking in low, angry tones on the phone, though I did not know who he was speaking to or what he was saying. On the fourth day, Father Michael came to visit. My mother showed him into the living room, and I came downstairs reluctantly, still wearing the same sweatpants and t-shirt I had worn for the past 3 days, my hair unwashed, my face bare. He looked older somehow, the lines in his face deeper, the weight of his years more pronounced. Emma, he said gently, gesturing to the couch across from him. Will you sit with me for a moment? I sat, perched on the edge of the cushion, ready to flee at any moment. He studied me for a long minute, those blue eyes seeing too much, and then sighed heavily. I am sorry, he said simply. I am sorrier than I can express for the pain this has caused you, and Marco, and both your families. If I could have prevented it, I would have, but the seal of confession is absolute. What Lucia told me in the confessional, I could never reveal, not even to stop this tragedy. Why did she do it? I asked, my voice rough from disuse. Why did she wait until the wedding? Why let us get that far? She struggled, he said. For months, she struggled with what to do. She came to me many times, seeking guidance, and I told her she needed to speak her truth, to break her own silence. But she was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean for Daniela, for her family, for her own reputation. She thought, I think, that Marco would break off the engagement on his own, that somehow the situation would resolve itself without her intervention. But when it did not, when the wedding day arrived and she saw you walking down that aisle, she knew she could not stay silent. She called me that morning, told me she was going to speak, and I begged her to let me handle it differently, to let me call you both in privately after the ceremony. But she said no, that the truth needed to be spoken in the light, witnessed by everyone, so there could be no more hiding. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the June warmth. The biology, I said quietly, cousins can marry in some places, right? It is not illegal? First cousins can marry in New York, yes, Father Michael confirmed. But you and Marco are not first cousins. Marco's father and Daniela's mother are siblings, which makes Marco and Daniela half-siblings, raised as full siblings. And Daniela's mother and your mother are sisters. The exact relationship is complex, but the reality is that you and Marco share enough genetic material to make a romantic relationship inadvisable, even if not technically illegal. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But more than the biology, Emma, there is the question of family, of relationships, of the bonds that tie us together in ways beyond blood. Marco grew up with Daniela as his sister. You are Daniela's niece. The family dynamics, the emotional realities, they make this situation untenable, regardless of what the law says. I nodded, though I had already known this, had already understood that even if there were no legal barriers, the emotional and familial complications made continuing our relationship impossible. You cannot unknow something like this, cannot unsee the connections that bind you in ways that make romance feel wrong. What do I do now? I whispered, more to myself than to him. You grieve, he said gently. You allow yourself to feel the loss of what might have been. You take time to heal. And eventually, when you are ready, you move forward. But there is no rushing this, Emma. What you have lost is real, and the pain you feel is legitimate. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. He left shortly after, but his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as the days continued to pass. Grieve. Heal. Move forward. Simple words for an impossibly complicated process. On the 7th day, a letter arrived. It was hand-delivered by Daniela, who stood on the doorstep looking as hollow and devastated as I felt. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I saw in her eyes the same questions I had been asking myself. Who am I now? What is my identity? How do I move forward from this revelation? This is from Marco, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He asked me to bring it to you. He thought maybe you would see me when you would not see him. She held out the envelope, thick and heavy, and I took it with shaking hands. Daniela, I started, but she shook her head. I do not know what to say to you, she said. You are my niece, apparently, but you are going to be my sister-in-law. I do not know how to process that, how to make sense of any of this. My whole life has been a lie. I spent the last week looking through baby pictures, trying to see if I could tell, if there were signs that I missed. And Marco, God, Marco is destroyed. He barely leaves his room. He barely speaks. I have never seen him like this. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and impulsively, I reached out and pulled her into a hug. We stood there on the doorstep, two women bound by blood and circumstance and shared grief, holding each other as we cried. When we finally pulled apart, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and managed a weak smile. Read the letter, she said. He deserves that much, at least. And then, whatever you decide, he will accept it. We will all have to find a way to accept it. She left, and I went back inside, clutching the letter like a lifeline. I sat on my bed, staring at my name written in Marco's familiar handwriting on the front of the envelope, and finally, after what felt like hours, I opened it. My Emma, it began, and just seeing those two words made my chest ache. I have started this letter 100 times and thrown it away 100 times, because there are no words adequate to express what I feel right now. Rage. Grief. Disbelief. Love. Yes, still love, even though I know I should not feel it, even though I know it is wrong now in ways it was not before. I am sorry. I know those words are inadequate, but I do not know what else to say. I am sorry that my family's secrets destroyed what we had. I am sorry that you had to find out this way, in front of everyone, on what should have been the happiest day of our lives. I am sorry for every moment of pain you have felt since. I have been trying to make sense of how this happened, how the universe could be so cruel as to bring us together, let us fall in love, and then reveal that we should never have been together in the first place. My mother says it is God's will, that he was protecting us from making a terrible mistake. Father Michael says it is human fallibility, the consequences of secrets kept too long. I do not know what I believe anymore. What I do know is this: you are the love of my life. You are the person I was meant to find, even if I was not meant to keep you. These 3 years with you have been the best of my life, and I will carry them with me always, treasure them even as they break my heart. I know we cannot be together now. I understand why, even though every part of me rebels against it. But I need you to know that this, us, what we had, it was real. It was right, in the context we knew at the time. We did nothing wrong. We loved each other honestly and completely, and no revelation can take that away. I am going to leave New York for a while. I cannot stay here, surrounded by memories of you, seeing the places we went together, smelling the smells that remind me of us. My cousin in Rome has offered me a job in his restaurant, and I am going to take it. Maybe distance will help. Maybe time will heal what feels unhealable right now. Please take care of yourself, Emma. Please let yourself be happy again, eventually, when the grief passes. You deserve joy and love and all the beautiful things life can offer. And please, if you can, forgive my mother. She was trying to protect us, in her own way. She has been carrying this secret for so long, and I think speaking it destroyed her as much as it destroyed us. I love you. I will always love you. But I release you from any obligation to me, from any promise we made, from any tie that bound us. Go forward, my Emma, and find the life you were meant to have. Always, Marco. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words, before I finally folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. He was leaving. Marco was leaving New York, leaving the country, putting an ocean between us. And I knew, with a certainty that settled in my bones like lead, that it was the right thing for him to do, even though it felt like another loss piled on top of all the others. That night, I finally responded to the texts that had been accumulating on my phone, the messages from friends and colleagues and distant relatives who had heard about the wedding disaster. I wrote brief, clinical responses, confirming that yes, the wedding had been called off. No, I did not want to talk about it. Yes, I was fine, I was handling it, I was moving forward. Only to Sarah did I tell the truth. Not fine, I texted. Will never be fine again. But still breathing, so that is something. She showed up 20 minutes later with ice cream and cheap wine, and we sat on my childhood bed like we were teenagers again, and she let me talk and cry and rage until I had no more words or tears left to give. The weeks that followed were marginally better than the days, though better is perhaps too generous a word. I returned to my apartment, forced myself to pack away anything that reminded me too strongly of Marco, and tried to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I went back to work at the small graphic design firm where I had been employed for the past 5 years, and my colleagues were kind enough not to ask questions when they found me crying in the bathroom. My relationship with my mother shifted, became more complex. I found myself angry at her in ways I had not expected, angry that she had never mentioned her sister, never warned me that there might be family in New York I should know about. But she had her own grief to carry, her own shock at what her sister had kept hidden, her own guilt over the estrangement that had led to this disaster. One evening, about 6 weeks after the wedding that was not, she came to my apartment and sat at my small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea I had made her. "Emma," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something about my sister, about why we stopped speaking." I sat across from her, waiting, and she took a deep breath before continuing. "When Lucia came to America, she was 18, young and idealistic and full of dreams. Our parents had arranged for her to marry Giuseppe, a good Italian boy from a good family. She did not love him, not at first, but she was obedient, and she did what was expected. I was younger, only 15, but I was her confidant, her best friend." She paused, sipping her tea, her eyes distant with memory. "After she married, after Marco was born, she changed. She became hard, bitter, obsessed with tradition and propriety. When I fell in love with your father, an American soldier with Irish roots, she was furious. She said I was betraying our heritage, abandoning my culture. We had terrible fights, said awful things to each other. I left for California with your father, and Lucia and I barely spoke after that. Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, but the warmth was gone. I did not know about Daniela's true parentage, did not know she was actually my daughter, the child I might have helped raise if our relationship had been different." "Wait," I said, my mind struggling to process this new information. "Daniela is your daughter? Not just Lucia's sister's daughter?" My mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "My sister, our younger sister Maria, she was wild, rebellious. When she got pregnant at 17, our parents were mortified. Lucia offered to take the baby, to raise it as her own, and Maria agreed. She did not want to be a mother, not then. After the baby was born, she left Italy, went to London, eventually came to America and married a man named James Harper. She had you 9 years later, after she had grown up, after she was ready to be a parent. So Daniela is my half-sister," I said slowly, trying to map out the relationships. "And Marco is, what exactly?" "Your cousin, once removed," my mother said. "The biology is complicated, but the emotional reality is what matters. You grew up thinking you had no extended family in New York, and Marco grew up with Daniela as his sister. The relationships are tangled in ways that make romance impossible." "Does Maria know?" I asked. "Does she know about any of this?" "I called her after the wedding," my mother said. "She was shocked, devastated. She lives in Arizona now, has for the past decade. She wants to meet you, when you are ready, and she wants to try to reconnect with Daniela. But she understands if neither of you want that, given the circumstances." I sat back, overwhelmed by these new revelations, by the complicated web of family relationships I had suddenly been thrust into. I had spent 29 years thinking I was an only child, and now I discovered I had a half-sister I had almost married into the family of. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it were not so heartbreaking. Over the following months, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I threw myself into my work, took on extra projects, stayed late at the office to avoid my empty apartment. I started therapy, working through the grief and betrayal with a patient woman named Dr. Chen who specialized in complicated family dynamics. I began, cautiously, to date again, though I found myself comparing every man to Marco and finding them all wanting. Daniela and I began meeting for coffee once a month, navigating the strange new relationship we found ourselves in. She was seeing a therapist too, working through her identity crisis, and she told me about her journey of self-discovery, about reaching out to Maria, about slowly rebuilding her sense of who she was. She was angry at Lucia, she admitted, angry at the deception that had defined her entire life, but she was also trying to understand, to forgive. Lucia sent me a letter, 6 months after the wedding, a long, rambling apology written in a mixture of Italian and English. She begged my forgiveness, explained her reasoning, tried to make me understand the cultural pressure she had felt, the shame that had driven her to keep the secret for so long. I read it once and put it away, not ready to forgive but not ready to condemn either. She was a complicated woman who had made complicated choices, and she would have to live with the consequences. From Marco, I heard nothing. Daniela told me he was still in Rome, working in his cousin's restaurant, learning traditional Italian cooking techniques, trying to find himself in the country of his heritage. He asked about me, she said, wanted to know if I was okay, but he did not reach out directly. The distance between us, it seemed, was permanent. A year passed, then another. I moved to a new apartment in Manhattan, started a new job at a larger design firm, slowly built a life that did not revolve around the loss of Marco Benedetti. I dated, though nothing serious, nothing that made me feel the way Marco had. And then, on a cold February morning 2 years after the wedding that never was, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost did not answer, my finger hovering over the decline button, but something made me pick up. "Emma?" The voice was hesitant, accented, familiar in a way that made my heart stutter. "This is Giuseppe, Marco's father." I sat down heavily on my couch, my hand gripping the phone too tightly. "Giuseppe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Is everything okay? Is Marco? He is fine, Giuseppe said quickly. Physically, he is fine. But Emma, I am calling because there is something you need to know, something we all need to know. Father Michael, he asked me to contact you. He is very sick, Emma. Cancer. He does not have much time left, and he has asked to see you and Marco together. He says there is something he needs to tell you both, something important that he can finally reveal now that he is dying. My mind reeled, trying to process this information. Father Michael was dying, and he wanted to see us both. Together. After 2 years of silence, of distance, of trying to forget. When? I asked, my voice shaking. This weekend, if you can come, Giuseppe said. He is at St. Vincent's Hospital. Marco is flying in from Rome tomorrow. Please, Emma. He says it is important, that it will change everything. I do not know what he means, but he was very insistent. I will be there, I heard myself say, though every instinct screamed at me to refuse, to protect myself from more pain. What time? Saturday afternoon, 2 o'clock, Giuseppe said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. Thank you, Emma. Thank you for being willing to do this. After we hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, my mind racing. What could Father Michael possibly have to tell us that would change anything? The truth had been spoken 2 years ago. The relationships mapped out. The impossibility of our situation made clear. What more was there to say? But I had loved Father Michael, in the way you love a wise teacher or a kind mentor, and if he was dying, I owed him this final visit. Even if it meant seeing Marco again. Even if it meant reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. Saturday arrived too quickly and too slowly at once. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue dress and minimal makeup, and took the subway to the hospital. The February cold was bitter, and I huddled in my coat as I walked from the station, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and sickness, and the fluorescent lights were harsh and unforgiving as I made my way to Father Michael's room. Giuseppe was waiting outside, and he embraced me when he saw me, his hug tight and emotional. Thank you for coming, he said again, and I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. Marco is already inside, he warned me gently. Are you ready? I would never be ready, but I nodded anyway, and Giuseppe opened the door. The room was small and sterile, dominated by the hospital bed where Father Michael lay, looking impossibly frail and diminished. But it was Marco I saw first, standing by the window, his back to the door. He had changed in 2 years, I noticed immediately. His hair was longer, touching his collar, and he had filled out slightly, his shoulders broader, his stance more confident. When he turned at the sound of the door, when our eyes met for the first time in 2 years, the air left my lungs in a rush. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but he was still achingly beautiful, still the man I had loved with everything in me. His eyes widened when he saw me, and I watched him grip the windowsill behind him for support, his knuckles white. Emma, he breathed, and my name in his voice, with that slight Italian accent, made my eyes fill with tears. Marco, I managed, and then Giuseppe was guiding me further into the room, toward the bed where Father Michael lay watching us with those wise blue eyes. Children, Father Michael said, his voice thin and raspy but still carrying that gentle authority, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult for you both, but what I have to tell you cannot wait any longer. I am dying, and I need to clear my conscience before I meet my Maker. He paused, gathering his strength, and a nurse who had been sitting quietly in the corner offered him water through a straw. He sipped gratefully and then continued. 2 years ago, I told you that I could not break the seal of confession, that what Lucia told me in the confessional had to remain sacred. And that was true, as far as it went. But there is something I did not tell you, something I have been carrying for far longer than Lucia's secret. Marco moved closer to the bed, and I found myself doing the same, drawn by the urgency in Father Michael's voice. We stood on opposite sides of the bed, careful not to touch, not to get too close, but united in our confusion. When you were born, Marco, Father Michael said, looking at Marco with an intensity that belied his frailty, your mother was very ill. She had complications from the birth, and the doctors said she would not survive. Giuseppe, desperate to save his wife, came to me and asked me to pray for a miracle. And I did pray, all through that long night, I prayed for Lucia's life. He paused again, his breath coming in short gasps. But in the early hours of the morning, before dawn, something else happened. A young woman came to the church, in labor, desperate and alone. She had nowhere else to go, no one to help her. I took her to the hospital, stayed with her through the birth, and she had a healthy baby boy. Marco made a sound, low and confused, but Father Michael held up a shaking hand, asking for patience. That woman, she did not want her baby. She was young, unmarried, ashamed. She begged me to find someone to take him, to raise him. And I thought of Giuseppe, sitting vigil over his dying wife, praying for a child who might now grow up without a mother. And I made a terrible decision. The room was utterly silent except for the beep of the heart monitor and Father Michael's labored breathing. I looked at Marco and saw that his face had gone pale, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension. Lucia's son, the baby she gave birth to that night, Father Michael said, his voice breaking, he did not survive. He died within hours of being born, before Giuseppe even knew. And God forgive me, I switched the babies. I gave Giuseppe and Lucia the healthy baby boy, the one born to the young woman, and I told them it was a miracle, that their son had survived, that Lucia had pulled through. And they believed me, because they wanted to believe, because the alternative was too painful. No, Marco whispered, shaking his head violently. No, that is not possible. You are saying I am not their son? I am not Marco Benedetti? You are Marco Benedetti, Father Michael said firmly. You are the son Giuseppe and Lucia raised and loved. But by blood, no, you are not their biological child. Your birth mother, she left New York the next day, and I never saw her again. I do not know her name. I do not know where she went. You are not related to the Benedetti family by blood at all. The words hung in the air, impossible and yet undeniable. I stared at Father Michael, then at Marco, my mind struggling to process what this meant. If Marco was not biologically a Benedetti, then he was not related to Giuseppe, which meant he was not related to Daniela, which meant. We are not cousins, I said, my voice high and strange. Marco and I, we are not related at all. No, Father Michael confirmed, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. You are not related. You never were. I have carried this secret for 32 years, this terrible lie that I told in a moment of panic and misguided compassion. I thought I was doing the right thing, giving a baby a good home, giving a grieving couple their miracle. But I never imagined the consequences, never foresaw how this lie would hurt so many people. Marco sank into the chair beside the bed, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to think, as the world rearranged itself around this new truth. Why, Marco finally asked, his voice muffled by his hands, why did you not tell us 2 years ago? Why did you let us believe Lucia's story? Because, Father Michael said, I was a coward. Because I had spent 32 years living with my lie, and I was not ready to expose it, even to save you both from heartbreak. Lucia's story, as terrible as it was, seemed like the lesser evil. It explained why you could not marry without revealing my sin. But I have lived with the guilt every day since, and now, facing death, facing judgment, I cannot take this secret with me. You both deserve to know the truth. Does my father know? Marco asked, looking up, his eyes red. Does Lucia know? I told Giuseppe yesterday, Father Michael said. He is still processing it, still trying to understand. But Lucia, no, I have not told her. That conversation, if it happens, must come from Giuseppe. She may never forgive me, and I would not blame her. I moved then, without thinking, around the bed to where Marco sat. I knelt beside his chair, and he looked at me with such anguish, such confusion, that I could not help but reach out and take his hand. It was warm and familiar, and the touch sent electricity through my entire body. What does this mean? He whispered, his eyes searching mine. Emma, what does this mean for us? I do not know, I admitted, my voice shaking. I do not know what this changes or what it means. We spent 2 years apart, 2 years grieving, 2 years trying to move on. Can we just go back? Can we pretend those 2 years did not happen? Father Michael spoke again, his voice weaker now, fading. I cannot tell you what to do, he said. I cannot give you back the time you lost or erase the pain my silence caused. All I can do is give you the truth and pray that you will find a way to forgive me, and perhaps, to find your way back to each other. We stayed with Father Michael for another hour, asking questions, filling in details, trying to understand the full scope of what he had done and why. Giuseppe joined us, his face gray with his own shock and grief, and together we pieced together the story of that long-ago night and the decision that had shaped all our lives. When we finally left the hospital, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Marco and I walked in silence to a small cafe down the street, needing to talk somewhere neutral, somewhere that did not carry the weight of hospitals and revelations. We ordered coffee we did not drink and sat across from each other in a booth by the window. The cafe smelled of roasting beans and cinnamon, and soft jazz played from speakers overhead. For a long time, neither of us spoke, just looked at each other, relearning faces that had haunted our dreams for 2 years. I do not know where to start, Marco finally said, his hands wrapped around his cup. 2 years, Emma. 2 years of thinking I would never see you again, never hold you, never hear your laugh. 2 years of trying to forget you and failing every single day. And now I find out it was all for nothing, that we could have been together all along if that old man had just told the truth. There was bitterness in his voice, anger mixed with grief, and I understood it completely. But, I said gently, he did tell us the truth. Eventually. He could have taken this secret to his grave, let us go on thinking we were cousins, but he did not. He gave us the truth, even knowing it might not matter anymore, even knowing we might be too changed to find our way back. Are we? Marco asked, leaning forward, his eyes intense. Too changed? Because Emma, I need you to know, I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day in Rome, not when I was trying to date other women, not ever. You are still the person I see when I close my eyes, still the voice I want to hear when something good or bad happens. If there is any chance, any possibility that we could try again, I want to take it. My heart hammered in my chest, hope and fear warring within me. Marco, I whispered, I love you too. I have loved you through all of this, even when I thought I should not, even when I tried to stop. But 2 years is a long time. We have both changed, built new lives. Can we really just pick up where we left off? I do not think we can pick up where we left off, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. Too much has happened, too much pain. But maybe we can start over. Start fresh. Date properly, without secrets, without lies, without anything between us but us. Get to know each other again as the people we are now, not the people we were before everything fell apart. I looked down at our joined hands, at his fingers interlaced with mine, and felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been clenched tight for 2 years. Yes, I said, looking back up at him, meeting his eyes. Yes, I would like that. I would like to try. He smiled then, really smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him since before the wedding, and it transformed his face, made him look young again despite the lines of grief and time. Can I kiss you? He asked, his voice rough. God, Emma, I have dreamed of kissing you again for so long. May I? In answer, I leaned across the table, closing the distance between us, and pressed my lips to his. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, testing, remembering, and then it deepened, became more urgent. 2 years of longing and loss poured into that single connection. He tasted like coffee and hope and home, and when we finally pulled apart, both of us were crying. We sat in that cafe for hours, talking, laughing, crying, slowly rebuilding the bridge that had been burned between us. We talked about the 2 years apart, about what we had learned, about how we had changed. Marco told me about Rome, about the restaurant, about learning to make pasta from scratch from a 90-year-old nana who smacked his hands with a wooden spoon when he did it wrong. I told him about therapy, about Daniela, about the new life I had built in Manhattan. And slowly, carefully, we talked about the future. About what it would mean to try again, to rebuild our relationship from the ground up. It would not be easy, we both acknowledged. There would be complications, questions from family and friends, the need to process all the lies and revelations that had brought us to this point. But we were both willing to try, both willing to fight for what we had almost lost. Father Michael died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, held in St. Anthony's, the church where we had almost been married, Marco and I sat together, his hand holding mine. Lucia came, her face a mask of complicated emotions as she looked at the man who had both saved and cursed her son. Giuseppe sat with her, his hand on her shoulder, and I saw them whisper to each other, saw the way she leaned into him, still together after all these years despite everything. Daniela sat with us, and afterward, we went to dinner together, the 3 of us navigating the strange new configuration of our relationships. Daniela had met Maria, had started building a relationship with her birth mother while maintaining her bond with Lucia, and she seemed more settled, more at peace with her identity than she had been 2 years ago. Over the following months, Marco and I dated like teenagers, going to movies and museums, having long dinners and longer conversations. We took it slow, not rushing back into the intensity we had shared before, giving ourselves time to heal, to rebuild trust, to become people who could sustain a healthy relationship. 6 months after Father Michael's revelation, on a warm August evening, Marco took me back to that cafe in Brooklyn where we had first met. It looked the same, the neon signs still reflecting in the puddles from an afternoon rain, the smell of espresso still mixing with the scent of wet concrete. He ordered us both espresso, pulled the way he had been arguing about all those years ago, and we stood under the awning, laughing at the memory. Emma, he said, setting down his tiny cup and taking both my hands in his, I know we said we would take this slow. I know we agreed to rebuild carefully. But I have to ask you something, and if the answer is not yet, if you need more time, I will understand and I will wait. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, and my breath caught in my throat. This is not my grandmother's ring, he said, opening the box to reveal a simple platinum band with a small, perfect diamond. I could not give you that one again, not after everything that happened. This is new, chosen just for you, for who we are now. Emma Catherine Harper, will you marry me? Will you give me the chance to do this right, to stand in front of our family and friends and God and promise you forever? Yes, I said, the word escaping on a sob. Yes, Marco, yes. He slipped the ring on my finger, and it fit perfectly, catching the light from the street lamps. And then he kissed me, deep and thorough, there under the awning where we had first met, come full circle to the beginning. We got married 6 months later, on a cold February morning, in a small ceremony at City Hall. Only close family and friends attended, my parents, Giuseppe and Lucia, Daniela, Sarah, Marco's best man, and a handful of others. There was no church wedding this time, no elaborate ceremony, just 2 people standing in front of a judge, promising to love each other for as long as they both lived. Lucia came, though she did not smile, her relationship with Marco still strained by the revelations about his birth. But she came, and she kissed my cheek afterward, and whispered, "Take care of my son," and I knew it was her way of accepting, if not quite blessing, our union. Daniela stood as my maid of honor, and afterward, over lunch at a small Italian restaurant in the village, she toasted us with tears in her eyes. "To family," she said, raising her glass. "The ones we are born to and the ones we choose. May you both find the happiness you deserve." We moved into a new apartment in Brooklyn, a place with no memories of our past, only the promise of our future. Marco took a job as head chef at a new Italian restaurant in Park Slope, and I continued my work in graphic design, slowly building a portfolio I was proud of. We cooked together in our small kitchen, arguing good-naturedly about the proper way to make risotto. We went to Sunday dinners at Giuseppe and Lucia's, the meals awkward at first but slowly becoming easier as wounds began to heal. And we built a life, day by day, moment by moment, 2 people who had been torn apart and found their way back together, stronger and wiser for the journey. On our first anniversary, Marco woke me before dawn and led me to the roof of our building. The city was still dark, stars fading as the sun began to rise, and he held me close as we watched the sky turn from black to gray to pink to gold. 1 year, he murmured into my hair. 1 year of being married to my best friend, my love, my home. Only forever left to go. I tilted my head back to look at him, this man who had been a stranger and a lover and a forbidden dream and now, finally, was simply mine. "Forever sounds perfect," I said, and kissed him as the sun rose over Brooklyn, warming our faces, blessing this love that had survived secrets and lies and the cruelest twists of fate. We did not know what the future held, what challenges we would face or what joys we would find. But we knew that we would face them together, that the love we had fought so hard to keep was strong enough to weather anything. And that, in the end, was all that mattered.